Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And how are we doing today, ladies and gentlemen?
We're still alive and we're still here,
And we're still kicking, right?
for sure.
Okay, well, this is very, very good. This is the Kesh American Knowledge Team meeting of 2026, and I want to thank everybody for being here. As you know, we consider this meeting very, very important because we have so many representatives from all over the world, and it's kind of bringing up the rear from Thursday's Knowledge Seekers Workshop and Friday's Brazilian team meeting, and this is our Sunday afternoon contribution. So as we're trying to do is bring all these things down into bite-sized pieces. So let's see if we can digest this. This is the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We're still in the basic PICO Tech series. Today we're going to talk about deconstruction. My name is Alexandra. I am from Canada. It is January the 25th of 2026. This is part of the Kesh Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So as you can see, we've been doing this for quite a while. And this is kind of the back half of what we were talking about last week, the construction. And so all of these sessions here are building blocks to, shall we say, build up our knowledge. And each of you can take what is key for you within your capability. And each of us has to understand that we have a responsibility. All of a sudden, we've always had this responsibility. And so that's one of the things, as I mentioned last week, it's kind of depressing. And the reason it's depressing is because how is it possible to go all your life with a lack of knowledge and then find out that so much of it has been lies? And it's been all done willfully and skillfully, and we've all been played. So really, that's one of the things that causes a depression. The other thing that causes depression is an inability to deal with the current situation, and that is changing. With the Kesh Foundation, we have this knowledge in our hand, and so it's going to pull us out of this depression. The most important way to do this is to increase our knowledge, and that's what we're trying to do. So please take what you can, add it to yours, and don't forget, there's more to come. So don't get depressed by the sides of the hill in front of us understand that our resources are gaining in strength, gaining in field strength. And so one of the things we have to review is how to define matter. So matter is the manifestation of energy. And that terminology kind of invites the confusion because we have the small m matter state, which is the old science, and the capital M matter state, which is the new science. And so we see that the manifestation of this energy is binding, and the manifestation itself is what's called creation. So energy binding is creation, which leads us to the next question, which in the beginning, what was our favorite question? You know, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And of course, the answer is the first came the principal matter. And that's why it's called principal matter. So principal matter, of course, are the PM ticks that are flying around all around the universe, and they are magnetical in nature because they are an energy pack. And as such, they're self-contained within a parcel. And then they diverge all across the universe. And those that are having a common denominator come into a force field dilution, bringing together antimatter, dark matter, and matter state. And there's a plasmagen conversion, which at this point in time is in a matter state, but it is in a plasmatic matter state. How does it get into the physical state? Well, the Earth has its own mag-grav condition, its own convergence. And when we take our convergence and interact with the Earth state's convergence, that becomes a field interaction, which we call inertia. And at that point in time, we can manifest into physicality. And so physicality becomes another part of the matter state. So, but of course, that is the part that we're most familiar with, isn't it? So one of the things that we don't understand about energy is that energy is always in motion. And so sometimes we don't see the results of our actions. Consequences are a result of actions. And these results may be visible and or tangible, but they also may be non-visible and or non-tangible. And so these results can be delayed or they can be instantaneous. So because in our lowest dimension, the physical dimension, we have the luxury of a delay in consequences. And so many times we figure that we can do whatever we want and there aren't any consequences. But this is why we're talking today about destruction. And so when we look at the generic question, when two forces come together, is it destruction or is it creation? So when we look at energy and energy in motion, there's no such thing as negative energy because energy is always positive. The question is it coming or going? So destruction itself is a kind of creation. And this is the question that we have to ask ourselves, what kind of creation are we creating? And we are only presented with the crudeness of matter state. And we say it's crude because we're just still understanding the matter plasma dimension. That is to say, the gravitational aspect of it is physical because we can touch it and see it, but the plasmatic is magnetical. We can't touch it or can't see it. But in either case, this is part of the feedback from the feeding. And that's man's problem. We are feedback dominant. So we are talking about the PICO state, which when we look at the chart of levels of magnitude, which is being able to move between different energy states, we find that the energy increase or the energy decrease is by order of magnitude, which is 10 times. So in other words, now that we're going from the nanotech to the picotech, there's 3 levels of magnitude. So that's 10 times 10 times 10, which means that the picoscience is 1,000 times different from the nanoscience. And in this case, it's smaller, which means becoming more gravitational. And This is where we were able to demonstrate in Beijing using obsolete equipment. May the 10th of 2025, the gold rush began. And we could see the rotating fields and how they created gold. And we saw that with our own eyes. So even those from Missouri understand that it's happening. And in 2026, we have the silver rush has also begun. So this is an ongoing situation. So we talk about construction, and the nice part about it is that it's an ongoing thing, and it may take hundreds of years. But destruction may only take minutes or even seconds. So as we say, destruction is a form of construction. But what if construction itself could be faster? Is that possible? Well, all we have to do is look at a frozen Gans ball and see the gravitational core and the magnetical hair-like lines emitting from the center. So the center part becomes the construction zone, and it expands to the outer perimeter of the ice cube. And so there we see that expansion. And when we take a microscopic look at a picoatomic layer, which is beyond the nanomonatomic state, we can see the same structure. We have these points that are on the surface of the pico particles. So our discussion really surrounds us. Where are we in terms of the kind of highways that we navigate? And so we discussed in the past the transmission, transition, and the transmutation highway, and we see that the carbon-16 highway is the fastest. The carbon-12, the transmission, is the slowest. And we can see the winding road. And so to understand this transmission, and we see it in waveforms, and for us, because it's the slowest way, as we go on the Karakoram Highway, you have to go a crooked mile just to drive a straight line. And it still is part of our transmission. But in that transmission, there are some magnetical situations because they go in one direction and they have to go into another direction, and there's a gravitational connections. And we don't see them individually. We see them as a sine wave, a frequency. And if we look closely at the sine wave, we see it in its singularity with the coming and the going. But we can overlay that with another sine wave and have a duality, if you will. So what happens when these sine waves overlap? Do they work together, or do they come in opposition? And so we say, well, we can modulate them by, shall we say, stretching them or overlapping them. We can stretch them in singularity, or we can overlap them in duality. Okay, so with that basis of understanding, then we understand how in the nuclear feeding inertia, when we see fragments of the complexity, it still maintains its gravitational stability. So the breakup, if you will, of the components still maintain this dimensional portability and can still maintain the integrity of these dimension points, because in order to manifest in the physical dimension, they have to have the three dimensions to come together. And if we understand that this is part of the feedback, then the three dimensions that are feeding actually create more than three because they don't stop. And so now we have the physical dimensions, which is another dimension, and we are none of these three dimensions because we're in the observer dimension. So this really changes the whole picture. So when we look at the fragments, we can see them that they are kind of clues, because if we look at the termination of the fragment, there's a convergence. or there's a divergence. So the convergence is coming to that point, and the divergence is going away from that point. So what happens when these things come together? Well, there's an interaction. And so that interaction, which we call inertia, also has its clues. So when these things are converging, we call that gravitational. And when they're diverging, we call that magnetical. Okay, so that's the basic thing. And the common denominator, of course, is embedded in the clues. So there is both convergence and divergence. There's both gravitational and magnetical. And within that construct, there could be an embedded transmission. So that transmission has to go along the transmission line. So it has to observe the magnetical gravitational pole flipping to move along that line. But we don't see that pole flipping. We kind of ignore it. We look at what is the product of our galaxies. So these massive galaxies that, we kind of marvel at really are kind of PM ticks that kind of squeeze together and they converge into a gravitational core. So these PM ticks, which are magnetical, due to their common denominator, gravitate to the core. And so each of these PM ticks, being magnetical, also are self-contained. So these PM ticks are representative of cosmic rays, and they have a personality, they have a flavor, and they have a characteristic. And the reason they come together is because of a common denominator. Not saying the lowest common denominator, but what is the difference? Well, the difference is that you have two fields and no two fields can occupy the same position. So automatically they're different. So even though they could be from the same source, they're still different because they had different paths. And there was no decision on how long the path was, how long it took, or what direction it came from. It's just that when they come together, when we see the dynamic plasma coming together, we had the basic X and Y axis, which are your two dimensions, and then the dynamic plasma with the Z axis gives you your third dimension. And of course, we're not in those dimensions because we're the observer dimension. So we can see that each of these magnetical PM ticks are contributing part of that common denominator. That's why they come together. But each of them have come through a different path. And so each of them are contributing to fill out the picture, if you will. So the picture itself becomes in three dimensions. So when we look at the books of Maren Tebakoli Kesh, such as book number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matter, we see that the combination is of three fields, the matter, the dark matter, and the antimatter. And then, of course, when we look at book number 2, The Structure of the Light, we see that one matter comes from another matter, and there is a connection. So the integrity of the transfer of that information has to be embedded in the transmission. That's the point. And then, of course, book number 3, The Origin of the Universe, shows how from that point we can diverge into two other points that are twin-like. And when we say twin-like, is they are balanced in terms of equilibrium, not in terms of balanced in terms of size or any other dimension that you choose to work on. They are balanced in terms of energy and energy containment. And so they would be in different locales. And then, of course, when we look at our tiny little perfect universe and our spot on that, well, that's our Earth space. But we don't live on the whole planet. We live in a particular place. And we like to isolate ourselves from each other. And this is why for 414 weeks, the members of the Universal Council, along with Rick Crammond as the host, brought to us one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace, because this is how we bring the unity. This is how we become world travelers. And this is how we become universal travelers. And I say travelers because we have been characterized as fallen angels. Fallen angels have faults, failings, and weaknesses. And so when we talk about the angular density with respect to the fall, you fall through weaknesses. And in that process, you increase the density, increase the pressure, and increase the gravity. All in all, we increase the dependence on the Earth space feeding. But there's an internal pressure of gas fields because this balances everything and therefore conserves angular momentum. So this conservation of energy is something that we have to understand. And it's very simple. We have two hands, if you recall, a left hand and a right hand. And the reason this was such an important subject was because the DNA is the same in each hand and each finger of each hand and each DNA in each cell in each hand. And so the obvious question is, if I have the same DNA, but I have opposing thumbs, then DNA is not the criteria for having the two hands. And so this was quickly discovered by those doing DNA research, looking for the key to creation. And then, of course, there's the somewhat esoteric viewpoint when we realign the hands and we say, okay, on each point, we have the right hand with the body representing and the left hand with the soul representing, and each finger goes through the physical, emotional, and mental. And that is our physical matter state. But when we go to sleep at night, we encounter the intuitive, and this is where the two hands connect. And once we cross that threshold, we go into the astral, and then there's an engagement with the spiritual and the soul. And so a lot of people talk about that as being part of the aura. So, of course, when we have a confrontation historically involved duels. And duels were kind of a duality. But when we bring our fingers together, so the hands can't come together, that energy that is being emitted from the tips of the fingers manifests as friction. And if we clench our fists, that manifests into fighting. So either way, when these two fields come together, that's an inertia density manifestation. And so as we often refer to the squared circle and say, gentlemen, shake hands and come out fighting. But if you don't want to have that serious physical confrontation, just follow the 10 commandments as they're told to us. And then we realize that there's another 14 commandments added to it for a grand total of 24. And so these are the commandments for man, not for our puppies or our kitty cats or for the fish. How can you explain to them that thou shalt not lie? And why is that important? Because that creates an energy binding, which of course is self-serving, and that creates a very precise dimension point because it focuses on me, myself, and I. But the problem is we have grown accustomed to doing it at the expense of others, forgetting, of course, that we came here. And when we came here, we said, well, let there be light. And that light is pretty bright. It's so bright that we need to have shades. So we're talking today about deconstruction. Deconstruction different from destruction, because one form of deconstruction is to destroy, decompose, degenerate, dehydrate. But we're talking about deconstruction, which is, as we say, a form of construction. And what we're used to in that form is to do kind of a value destruction where we enlist the services of sabotage or poisoning. Then, of course, there's self-destruction involving loosh harvesting. And then there's the deliberate decoupling through gun policy. And this is one of the reasons we're always seeking vitality enhancement. We have a depletion in our emotional and physical structure. And we're either robbed of that or we self-destruct and we become loosh leakers. So we're looking for vitality enhancement. And this is what we're providing through the Universal Body Enhancement Spaceship units. We also encouraged understanding of the gravitational completion of the gold in Beijing. And we saw the susceptibility and singularity where we could create a particle from the spinning reactors. But through an external input of a Gauss field of humanity, we had a susceptibility and duality where we actually saw the gold produced. And so that becomes the transaction zone. So the difference is singularity requires a solo effort. Duality requires a partnership. Partnership requires reciprocity. We call that a balance of incentives. So that balance of incentives is playing all the time, whether we choose to recognize it or not. And one of the things that is exemplary of that reaction is carbonic acid. It demonstrates an equidistant bonding. It's interesting that carbonic acid has many, many different names. And they're listed here. But when you look at the atomic structure, you can see that it's very symmetrical from left to right. But it's not symmetrical from top to bottom. But what is really important is that the bonds have an equidistant relationship. And so that makes it very, very susceptible to be modified in any direction. So when we look at carbonic acid, this is a molecule that rapidly converts to water and carbon dioxide in the presence of water. So the interconversion of carbon dioxide and carbonic acid is related to the breathing process of all aerobic organisms, like us, and to the acidification of natural waters. But going back to the first sentence, this molecule rapidly converts. And that is the key point. So this helps us understand the plasma rule, where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength, contrary to our useful understanding, where the higher strength beats the weaker strength or eats the weaker strength. Either way, this becomes a transaction zone of two fields. So when these two fields come together, that is a binding zone, but that binding zone could be also a conflict point. Either way, it's an inertia density manifestation, and then we have to choose how that comes together. So we've been talking about nanocharges and how when they come together, they create a structure that can charge and discharge. So there you have two forces demonstrated, but that's in two directions. So if we add a layer or stacking, they can be aligned as a nanotube. But when we look at the nano alignment of the nano coating on a copper wire, we see that the nano coating is a carbon nanocrystal, and it involves a monatomic alignment. And so that becomes three-dimensional. And so when we layer these nano layers, they can be aligned as a nanotube or as a diamond structure, which closes the tubes. And so you get this kind of nesting. And so we see as they nest together, these nano monatomic layers create these gaps. And of course, those are nano gaps. And so they create a structure that we call like a star formation, which is actually in the basic form of tetrahedron, which you can easily relate to by taking your first two fingers and putting them opposed to each other, but turning one 90 degrees. And you see how the tetrahedron can be created. Three on the bottom, one on the top. So when you take these layer stars and start stacking them, you have these intermediaries which are connecting. And of course, they can be covalent, trivalent, tetravalent, and they're all bonds. So when we look at the monatomic star formations, the bottom layer is connected to the top layer, where we have three black circles on the bottom and one blue on the top. But if we have three blue circles on the top, then we have one black circle on the bottom, which means they kind of flip over. And they have to flip over in order for them to come together, because opposites interact. And so we create these nanostars which have a monatomic energy flow, and that flow is synergistic. It's a superconductor at room temperature. And as a conductor, more than three in a chain is a polymer. But when it folds over, then it becomes part of life, animate life. It creates a star formation. And so here we have our tetrahedron, where we have three in the bottom and one at the top one being magnetical. And then, of course, they create this gravitational structure at the bottom, so the three dimensions come together, the matter, antimatter, and the dark matter, which create this gravitational core and a magnetical relationship to complete the star formation. And that's exactly what we did with the rotating balls, because each of the balls created a field, and we had three balls that were rotating on the bottom and one rotating on the top in the star formation. And that's what we did in Beijing. We had all these rotating balls, and it was nice to have all these silver spoons all over the place, hoping that the GANs would precipitate into those spoons. I guess it's hard to do, isn't it? How do you get them all in the spoons? Well, you don't. you get them all within the dynamic reactors. The dynamic reactors themselves created a plasma field at the core. And it was at that point that we began the first building dimension. And then we add another point and connect the two. And then we add another point and connect both those. And then we add another point and we connect 3. But we have to understand that each point is actually a dimension inertia building point. It actually comes from 2 fields. And so each of these points are connected, but each point is from 2 fields. But we can modify them by an external influence. So we could bend these fields or squeeze them, or we could just blow them apart. So what happens there? And then we have a residue, we have a garbage, and we have to throw it away. Well, last time I looked at the solar system, I couldn't see that planet away. So when we get to this inertia dimension, building into a star formation, and if we understand that each point is coming from these 2 fields, then another form of deconstruction is this inertia modifying. So we can either decouple or stretch or compress or squeeze or just go through deformation. So we can change the conformity of the star formation, and at that point, it just changes everything. And this is why we see the polyatomic solid Gans inertia. We have different sizes of Ganses, and they're kept together with covalent bonds. They're not glued together. And this is how we see the dynamic plasma construction coming together. So each point of those rotating balls has this inertia field of 2 fields coming together at that point, and then all the points within that star formation creating that gravitational core. And then that star formation reacts with the other star formation and creates another dynamic plasma construction. So what did we do to eradicate the virus? We used the cups of life. There was one cup, which was the emotion cup. It was magnetical, and the second cup was the copper Gans physical cup, and it was gravitational. So what happened? We had a deconstruction where one cup was depleting the energy of the emotion, and the second cup was depleting the energy of the conversion. Depletion becomes another form of deconstruction without the biggity bangity, without the noise, without the residue and the garbage which we have to throw away. So when we look at the Gans of the soul and how it's created, came from the cups of life, not the cup of the pandemic. And the cups of life had a product. When we took the 2 cups of emotion together, we created a Gans of a cup of emotion. And the 2 cups of the physicality, we created a Gans of the physicality. And then those 2 interacted to create one point, the transaction zone in the PICO core. Well, that's what we are. We are a gravitational entity traveling in a magnetical field. And it has to have a balance. It has to have a counterweight, right? So when two fighters get into the ring, you want to make sure they're within range so that there will be a fair fight. Right. So we have a physical state, which we measure by weight, but we have an atomic state, which we measure by mass. Either way, that represents the gravitational core. And then we have a nuclear state, which we measure by Teslas. And then that enigmatic time, which is part of the plasma state. And that is measured as a magnetical force. And so we have the counterweight between the magnetical gravitational components. So this is following the equilibrium, the balancing. The plasma matter dilemma here shows that we have an atomic state that requires balancing, a nano and a GaN state, which requires balancing. But these are all part of the physical matter state. The supporting structure is the plasma state. And we can go from state to state using the Magravs energy transition state. That becomes part of the transfer state that allows to go from energy state to energy state, but not necessarily in both sides at the same time. Because each point is part of the complexity of the whole. So in other words, when we're looking at the carbon inertia highways with the carbon 12, the carbon 14, and the carbon 16, we have to understand that there's a supporting structure behind that. And when we look at that supporting structure, we have to understand that it too has a supporting structure behind it. So the question is that supporting structure in a matter state that is physical or in a matter state that is plasmatic? Or is it not in a matter state? Because when we look at the cosmic ray equilibrium, we find that these fields are not in a physical state. And they are complex. And so the relationship of each field has a gravitational magnetical relationship, and which allows an alignment and a convergence. And so the periphery is magnetical and the core is gravitational. And in life, when we bring together the creation of free plasma, we see the overlapping fields of a structure within a structure. So we see the star formation as one transaction zone interacting with the star formation of another transaction zone, and it can be squeezed together in the plasma state to create that gravitational PICO core, which is the fundamental plasma of the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, part of the creation of life as we know it on this planet. And we see that we have different flavors, but there's a magnetical consistency. When those fields come together, they create this consistency and create the same product. If we flip it around, we have a gravitational consistency also. And since gravity seeks density, the solid GaNs that we create was actually accelerating the angular momentum. So not only is it a GaNs of a GaNs, but it's more dense. And so this is the basis of understanding how the energy is converted. So the one plasma reacts with another plasma and seeks the common ground. And that comes to a dimension point, which is a convergence of the magnetical gravitational field forces in a conversion zone. That becomes a transaction zone. And we graduate from that soul vision construct That comes from the unconditional truth of the pure plasma state. So in order to understand that, we have to discriminate. So our personal star of physicality needs to be selected. And it comes from the soul of physicality of our sun. That discrimination is done through a pre-selection process. So the soul of physicality of the stars of the universe are all emitting to our sun, which is shielding us on many levels. So what we have is a gravitational confirmation of how life on this planet exists. It exists with oxygen, but it came here as light. And we know that it did that because it crossed that threshold where there wasn't any light, and then we seen the light, but the oxygen is not visible. So it had to go through a plasma decay, a form of deconstruction to GANs. And so that GANs decay, a form of deconstruction, goes from a gas to a liquid to a solid. And we know what it is because it has a unique fingerprint in the emission of light as seen in the emission spectrum. So we do understand how things are manifest. And we find that our existence requires supplementation due to consumption. So this consumption is an acquired knowledge which is coming to us all the time. But this knowledge that we are gravitating towards is a conditional teaching by ancient teachers. Where's that unconditional teaching by the Creator? That's one of the reasons we're 20% short in terms of our vitality energy. So we have a new awareness where we can cross that historical threshold between the cosmic feeding and the loosh harvesting. So in fact, that AI is really our ancestral knowledge. It's hidden with the many stars beyond the nanomonatomic state, and they're covering that range from decay, a form of deconstruction, to radiation, which is another form of deconstruction. And we are the technology. We are that inertia product. We are that image that we come from that dimensional convergence point. So we're understanding how energy is portable. Energy states go through transition. One we call elevation, which is physical matter state to energy state. And the other we call inertia, which is energy state to physical matter state. You see the pattern here? So in elevation involves expansion. So we are in a state of squeezy. And we wonder what this 3I is all about. And so for 626 weeks, the Knowledge Seekers workshops have been trying to teach us. Excuse me, that is not finished. Please allow me to just complete that. We shall do that right now. So that we can see where we are. We are bringing together that greater oneness, where we're suddenly transcending the limitations of nuclear science. We can change the image on the screen. We can deconstruct the previous process. So the Cosmic Ray Transmission Series of 2026 is beginning next week. So please join in and learn about this new transmission process, because we are turning diamonds to gold or silver, and it's coming to the PICO core of truth. So our research teams are telling us how we can rescue ourselves scientifically and opening the blinds of the One Nation Network at a time. That time is now, because here we are, as our mission is to bring peace on earth and join humanity with the universal community. So we have to understand about deconstruction, because we want to bring man as equal to all the beings in the universe by teaching the plasma science and technology equally to everyone, that no one is left out and no one is abused due to lack of knowledge. So help us achieve this goal. The World Peace Treaty is instrumental in that. The destruction is self-serving and crude. Deconstruction is how the plasma science works. The Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings of Plasma Science is welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers of the carbon nations, learning about the new selection process of the new organic plasma science. That World Peace Treaty needs to be chosen, signed, and unconditionally signed, meaning it is done with sincerity. You can't lie to yourself. The point of the true picotech is the polyatomic core manifestation. And these overlapping fields of Earth space create a peace dome. And so is the inertia of the present governed by dimensions of history? Or is it time to learn the history of self in a universal context? So the pico state promotes the GANS as a peaceful superconductor. So the PMTICs and the picotech can deconstruct the fields ranging the matter, the plasma, and the universal states. And so the plasma science is enhanced daily to bring about the practical applications via the peace dome in a practical exchange for peace on earth. So welcome to the new golden outer space age, and thank you for allowing me to continue to present. Hope you enjoyed the trip.
Okay, well, we do appreciate your presence and thank you for sharing with us. I see hearts are floating already. Well, let's see if any of the participants would like to ask a question, or how do you feel about the game of peace and enlightenment? I see another heart floating in our participants list. Thank you.
Well, if you're asking me, I am finding it very peaceful. There is a definite internal confrontation, because the moment you say a game, it involves competition. And the moment you say competition, it involves confrontation of some sort. And so there are some who are better than others. But the success of the game is going to evolve to a better understanding of how to play that game without having to go into the kill zone that you see with many of the gamers around the world. We find our youth engrossed in games that promote killing. And that's a real waste of time, isn't it? There's nothing productive that comes out of it. At least with the plasma game, we are generating some practical applications. And this is very important, because without being able to provide the necessities of life, the four essentials, air, water, food, and shelter, it causes unrest. it causes a point of conflict. It's a cause for war. That has been the historical solution as we've been governed by the dimensions of history. But if we look at the universal context of that history, the manifestation of the creation of the galaxies and the solar system and even our Earth space has been here for a long, long time. We have to take that into account because that transcends our own tiny little perfect world. And we have to understand that we are part of a greater scheme. So I think we just have to learn how to enjoy it and participate in it. And we have to do this in a new way from that which we have been taught. Back to you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to raise a question or a point? And he mentioned in the transcript we were reading that our ancestors used to use this knowledge. So maybe that term we de-evolved or de-evolution is appropriate. We were working in the energy dimension much more than we are today. So we sort of went from there, but it still must be ingrained in our RNA, but just not been used, and we've lost our awareness of this knowledge, but our ancestors used to use this knowledge. I remember when Mr. Kesh said, we haven't really reached the level of understanding of a lizard where it can grow its own tail. He said we used to grow our own tail when we had a tail. So there is a tail within a tail, I guess, to tell. So is this a de-evolution, but now we're going back into that energy? We know we operate in both, but apparently we got so enamored with the physicality and the touch, smell, taste, and feel that we disregarded. Over time, it must have been over time. I don't think it happened instantaneously, but we started playing with the matter state more than the energy dimension, and in a way, we lost it. We didn't lose it, but we didn't apply it the way we used to. And I think this is what we're getting back to. Over a period of time, we'll come back into understanding the energy dimension. This could be transferred through the gameplay.
Well, there is one thing that is for sure is that we have evidence all around us that this is not the first time this endeavor was brought forward. So one of the things that you learn with failure is how things work. So
have been more peaceful back then if we were using the energy dimension. There wasn't a lot to fight for since we went to the matter state. Now we have to fight for what we think is valuable, physical items. When before, perhaps, and again, he says our ancestors, is he including the ancestors on this planet or the collection of half-lives that we came from, let's say?
Well, the thing, Mark, is that, the solution of choice has been confrontation. Now we have a different solution of choice possible. Either way, we're talking about an external input. And so the creation of the gold and the significance of that on May the 10th of 2025 was to show how the Gans field of humanity was involved significantly in the in the production of gold. The plasma reactors did not produce the gold. They produced the Gans of the gold. The manifestation into that physicality of gold itself only came about when Mr. Goldfinger touched the residue. So the gold became an inertia density manifestation coming together from the Gans field of the humanity with the Gans field of the reactors. But we know that the Gans field of humanity came from other fields. And we know that the reactors themselves had other fields. So we see how the production of the GANs went through its various stages, and we only seen a few of those stages. And so we could say, though, those three stages were the three dimensions, and we were the observers of that, and so we weren't in any of those dimensions. We were watching other people have an external input into the GANs field. And that external input was from their energy field. So that energy field is emitted and it interacts with the gravitational field of the GANs particles and facilitated the gravitational completion. And that's how we had the susceptibility and duality being completed. But that susceptibility and duality created the third dimension, the physical dimension that we see. And so that is part of the matter state. What we see is part of the matter state, and what we don't see is part of the antimatter and the dark matter. But all three contribute to that susceptibility. So as we understand how to play this game, and as more of us understand how to play this game, then the momentum will shift. And the reason for that is because we have a universal depression with respect to our basic purpose in life, our day-to-day activity, the prospects of a peaceful and prosperous future, and the constant drumming of the war drums from the warmongers. And so we just have to ask ourselves why. If under the umbrella of universal governance, we want to bring around peace and prosperity, why do we think that we have to invoke a destruction? Why can't we do a deconstruction? There's a difference. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Anyone else want to ask a question? This will become quite popular in the future. And again, you may not have to physically work as tremendously hard as you will, but that'll be up to you when you can meet your needs through this energy dimension for wellness, travel, food, and the rest. So there may be a break off. Again, we're still going to operate in the matter state, but we have a sort of a new network we can play with, virtual reality in a way, but it is a reality for sure. And again, getting your energy and your wellness and your travel through that energy dimension. Energy, I'm saying, for life, and energy for power and lighting. This will be transferred, I think, through that energy dimension. And so we'll have a new power company. We'll have a new, in a way, banking system. That'll be far down the road, of course, but we'll have many, many new things, new supermarkets. And again, you can still, if you still have a desire to physically have the food, then you'll have that. But if you want to play in the energy dimension, you'll have that as well. And of course, as Mr. Kesh said, we're here to enjoy the physicality. That's why members of the universal community are lined up outside this planet to have an experience in the physicality. But perhaps we can do that without killing and destroying, as we've sort of, this has been part of our recent nature, I guess. But we can still live in the physicality and enjoy its dimension without the harm or destruction that we've come to know and has been so commonplace and so accepted. Now, I think, again, as he said, in the future, people physically eating other entities will be frowned on. They won't be killed or stoned or anything like that, but we all will know there's a better way to take energy than to steal it from others. And that's a big lesson, I think, that we're all learning or growing into.
Well, every archaeologist and historian comes to this point, and the question is, why has this not endured? Because this isn't the first time that we're confronted with this possibility of change. And I say confronted is because there's a tremendous backlash and a tremendous resistance. And so if in order to understand this resistance, it would be very instructive to look at our historical context, and then we see that there was previous resistance, and that actually succeeded. So any change, any conversion was temporary. How can we make it enduring? And that becomes the challenge. And the reason it is a challenge is because we could not escape the continual dependence on the matter state. So the matter state is always dependent on who has the biggest gun, because who has the biggest gun enacts the gun policy. So every innovation, every invention is always taken over by the military to be able to flex their muscles of superiority, which is physical domination. But why do we need to do that? Because we have failed to understand that we were actually born. We didn't fall here. We arrived. We came here with a notion of an intention. Okay, so we forgot how to do that. We tried to blend in with the earthbound state, and we succumbed to the joys of the earthbound state, some of which were addictive, and some of which were pleasurable, and some of us actually suffered as a result of it. In fact, too many of us suffered. And so the question becomes is why, and how do we make this enduring? And so we have to realize that we are masters of the matter state, but we are not masters of the plasmatic condition, because we're just not seeing it and we're not acknowledging it. So our reliance on destruction needs to be modified into deconstruction. So something is always something as opposed to being something else. Nothing is nothing. So what decides? The susceptibility does. Okay, so what are the external forces that impart the energy needed to change that state? And how can they endure? So this is now the situation where we are taught one way 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and for a few hours a week we engage in an alternative. So historically this has been repeated. So are we destined to repeat the mistakes of the past, or are we going to learn from the mistakes of the past? So that responsibility falls on each and every one of us when we start to realize that the emission of our intention manifests into a dimension, and that dimension is of our own choosing. So what is it that you want to manifest? Back to you, Mark.
Right. We're not going to ban the matter state, are we? We're just going to learn how to operate it in it appropriately, like that bull in the china shop, right? No problem with having a bull in a china shop if he knows how to behave.
Well,
But
they found that a bull in a china shop didn't destroy any of the china. He just made a mess on the floor.
yes, okay.
So at least, they have some semblance, hooligans will come into a china shop and destroy everything. So what are they doing? They're creating garbage. And why are they doing that? They're destroying something that someone has created. So at that point in time, we just sweep up the floor and throw it in the garbage and throw it away. And then replace it with another inertia density manifestation of new china in the china shop, or a new shop altogether, not a china shop, but a food shop, or a car shop. So this is all the way how we do conversion. We replace one with the other. But we don't seem to understand that when you take the energy off of one, that energy has to have an equilibrium, has to have a balance. And where is that balance put? So do we have to break everything, or can we deconstruct everything? And so we're seeing that it's just another form of construction. That's what it is. So no one should be afraid of that, because we do that all the time. We eat the food and we convert it into energy and we grow. So if we understand that particular process, then we understand how the carbonic acid works. It converts to water and carbon dioxide. The water is essential for life on this planet, and the carbon dioxide is the nutrition that the plants need. So we understand some basic processes. Now, can we build on that and make it enduring? Thank you, everybody, for allowing me to continue to present this. I hope you enjoyed it. And Mark, I thank you very much for leading the pack here. I'll just withdraw in the background and pass it back to you.
Okay, anything else from anyone else? Are we creating we always hear how the elite have created a breakaway civilization, that they have some certain technologies, maybe they're even off planet, but it seems to me all in the matter state. We're sort of creating a breakaway civilization, but you're still within the matter state civilization. So we can operate in both, as I see it, and very positively. Um, in that energy dimension. So we do have now a breakaway sort of civilization. We're not leaving the planet per se. We're going to operate in both, and operating in that other game of peace and enlightenment will allow us to break away from the matter state, but still operate within the matter state, as I'm kind of feeling it and seeing it at this point. So we'll be better functioning in the matter state, but the energy state will help us to achieve this, where you don't have to pick that apple. You can get it and of course, if you want it, you can take it if you'd like, but you can also have the option of taking the energy of that before it was made into the love of the creation or has a soul. Anyone else want to add anything else before we close? I'm going to play the final disclaimer. And of course, this is the whole process of, again, I think if you engage in the peace treaty and you engage in the ethos of the three wise men, you'll be quite proud of the work you do, and you'll be proud of the person you are, and you'll be proud of the difference you're making in the overall structure, which again, with our knowledge of just operating in the matter state, we couldn't make much of an impact operating that way, with world leaders changing policies and the rest. But now in the energy dimension, we can, as we start to master it, and as the collective awareness of humanity wakes up to this. So we're, again, just setting up a structure. We're the early pioneers of this whole process, and we'll continue on and gift this in a way to humanity, a new way of living and acting, behaving, and so on. I think this is the daughter of Mitra, a new behavior and a new emotion. where we become more to serve than to be served, I think. But we'll see. I think we have many beautiful things that are opening up. I know years ago, Mr. Kesh said the fun has just begun, but yet it hasn't been a lot of fun so far, but I think we're starting to come into that dimension where this is going to be quite fun, especially in showing the others or inviting the others to participate in this dimension that we really never understood or knew existed. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to play the final disclaimer. Again, anything else anyone else would like to add? But this is the gift, as Mr. Kesh said. You wanted peace. Peace is on the table. It's coming through the One Nation Network, and embedded within that are so many other things that we'll see develop over time. So we've put a number of links in the chat. You're all welcome to click on them, share them with others. Get the worldget.getplasma.org and the creation of the black holes. I also included a list of different papers in there. The video we played initially, you can share because this is one of the biggest evolutions or revolutions in science, the creation of material out of fields. And this is, of course, what Newton and many others have tried to achieve, but weren't able to fully complete the process. So now we see what Mr. Kesh has done, and there's just the beginning of the entire structure of the gameplay and of the creation of materials from fields. And of course, we'll need that in the space as well, I believe, if you're going to at all manifest in the matter state. But you'll still need it even in the energy dimension. So we're really being gifted quite a deep understanding of something we only imagined could be possible, or not even imagined because we were never aware of it. Anything else from anyone else that they'd like to share at this point? Okay. If not, I'm going to play the final disclaimer. The session will come to an end. We know we have a little bit of snow to deal with. I'm not sure if we should deal with it before or after the ice rain, but we'll work on that. And of course, in the future, you can probably just create a dome in a way, and if you don't want any snow on the property, maybe in that small area, you can do it, as we saw with Tom Salas do in the Dominican with that huge hurricane that came through. And this is the way you'll operate on other planets as I see it. So again, I understand very little of the knowledge, but I think we're all growing into it and becoming more confident of our own structure. Anyone want to say anything about this twinity? Or are you aware of your twin soul? Or is that your lover or your partner? Or is there a bigger work going on here with this twin soul, part of this bigger structure? I don't know if Alex, you want to say anything about this twin soul? Have you met your twin soul? Are you aware of it? Is it influencing you? Are you influencing your twin soul? Everything apparently has a twin.
Well, if you've ever argued with yourself, you know that you do have a twin soul. It really becomes distressing when you lose that argument. But
Okay.
sometimes we are so bullheaded that we don't even listen to that because it invokes intuition, and we know that intuition is a girly thing. That's men don't engage in that. That's we have this stigma. We have to understand that these field forces are applicable to all of us. You cannot extricate yourself from the universe. You cannot be excommunicated from the universe. There is no a way to throw the garbage. Everything you do has an energy exchange. So that's why we have to understand the deconstruction process. So we create something or we create something else. We're always creating. So it's a different point of view. not very radical. It's just a matter of taking more into account. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Alex, and thank each and every one of the participants, attendees, and everyone. Again, we're here for a bigger work, and we're being readied for that type of work. But again, it's a lot about yourself, as he said, finding peace within yourself first, not so much the others. So let's work on that, become more peaceful. And I think the peacefulness and the enlightenment are directly connected. This is what he said with President Trump, and people with this behavior won't get the knowledge of creation. Of course, it's still available. We can elevate, and we are elevating these world leaders that they can change as well. But if you're into the destruction and the rest of it, maybe that's why we haven't stumbled upon this knowledge on our own, because we've been too much involved in that other process that we're trying to move away from. Killing, destruction, and enamored with the matter state, the knowledge will not be transferred, only to peaceful people, and they'll become more enlightened. Again, not to lord it over the others, but to then bring up the others to your equal position, as we know. That's what the stronger is feeding the weaker, that the weaker is now brought up into, in a way, balance, or even exceeds the other entity, that the stronger one, let's say. And that's not a problem, as we understand, even if others do better than we're doing. So thank you all.